It's wonderful to be back at Chicago and with so many friends and so many new faces. And it's my true pleasure to be able to talk to you about Power and Progress, our 1,000-year struggle over technology and prosperity, the book that Simon and I have been working on for a while and was published last May. And events since the publication of the book have only intensified the interests in these topics, I think. We are definitely in the midst of quite interesting, even impressive achievements in terms of new generative AI tools. ChatGPT became the fastest spreading technology to date. But key questions remain. Will all of this innovation deliver good outcomes for most of us? Will it yield shared prosperity, meaning prosperity out of which most people benefit? Who will control information? Who will control data? Who will decide the direction of technology? Where the next generation of innovations will go? These questions are sometimes asked, but not sufficiently. And part of the reason why they're not asked is because there are some types of optimism that many in the public sphere and some in academia, some in the tech industry have. And you can essentially have a sort of three types of optimism here, which I'm going to implicitly be talking about all three of them. One, you can believe in the technology a lot. So that would be like a techno-optimism, which would say that these new technologies are so wonderful that whatever you do and whatever rough edges around along the way, we're all going to benefit from them. You know, if we just get tremendous improvements in productivity, tremendous improvements in health, then perhaps all of these details are so second order. Or you can have market optimism, meaning that the market process will either make sure that we all benefit from it, or it will direct technology in the right way, so the bad outcomes will not occur. Or you can have institutional optimism, meaning that we will build the right institutions to confront any rough edges or any problems. So part of the reason why Simon and I wrote this book is to make the argument that these different types of optimisms are not warranted. That in history and today, there's nothing automatic about shared prosperity, and it requires a deeper analysis of what technologies are doing and explicit efforts to build institutional and regulatory barriers against the bad uses of these technologies. So where could sort of market or technological optimism come from? They both have actually a common origin, which is shared by many people in the tech industry, by many academic economists and some policymakers, which is that somehow technological improvements are going to trickle down to workers. And because most of us earn our livings as in the labor market by getting wages or salary, if there is sufficient sort of trickle down, then we're all going to be the beneficiaries of this, at least shortly, quickly, perhaps a decade, perhaps a few years, but this market process is going to work reasonably seamlessly. Despite the very common beliefs expressed in this concept, it doesn't actually have a name, so Simon and I had to christen it, and we called it the productivity bandwagon. So productivity increases are like a bandwagon, and it just pulls everybody together with it. So the causal mechanism would be technology improves, that increases productivity, meaning we can produce more with our existing factors of production, and then workers benefit from that. But when you dig into it, you'll see that that last step from productivity increasing to workers also benefiting is actually not so automatic. It requires two steps to both take place. One is that as productivity increases, firms go out there and want to hire more labor. We'll see that that's not actually so automatic, and we'll dig into that a little bit. And second, when firms want more labor, they acquire that via the market process of paying higher wages, and that's how wages get bid up. So I will argue that this really ignores two critical features: the nature of technology which I'm going to come back to. And the first thing that I'm going to start with, the first word or the title of the book, power. So power relations are key. So if you look at history, you will see many examples where technology improves and people benefit from it. But you will also see many examples that technology improves and people won't benefit from it. So I'll start with two that illustrate this power aspect. On the left, I'm showing one of the key innovations of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are sometimes referred to as dark ages, but actually they weren't dark in terms of innovation. There were many new innovations that were introduced in the agricultural economy and some in the other aspects of the production process. They were perhaps dark for people's lives, but that's part of what we're trying to explain. And the one on the left, the windmills, is one of the most important ones. They improved productivity in many tasks by tenfolds or so. But if you look at what happened to workers, the peasants essentially, there is no improvements in their living standards. Why is that? Well, it doesn't take much imagination to see why. This was a very peculiar society where a lot of production processes were embedded in coercive structures, serfdom and servile labor, and moreover the windmills were completely monopolized by the upper aristocracy and the upper clergy, who were not only able to charge whatever prices they wanted, they actually could close competitors, and they could compel people to use their windmills. Of course, they became the beneficiaries of the new technology and workers didn't. The one on the right is even more telling. It's one of the many versions of the cotton gin that were invented at the end of the 18th century. This one is by the famous innovator Eli Whitney. It enabled the type of cotton that could be grown in the US South to be cleaned and therefore produce yarn. Before then, the US South was essentially an economic backwater. As soon as the cotton gin was introduced, cotton production skyrocketed and the US South became the biggest exporter of cotton in the world, and it was the engine that really drove the British textile industry, about which I'll talk about in the next slide as well. So you might expect, again, huge improvements and big fortunes were made. Perhaps workers also benefited, but no, the workers, the enslaved black people, were actually worse off at the end because they were moved into the deep south where working conditions became harsher, working days longer, coercion increased, and again, power and the institutional structure is key. But that's not the only thing that I want to talk about. It's a very important thing, but also the nature of technology matters. The Industrial Revolution is also sometimes told as a story of, look, there were disruptive technologies, but everything worked out. If you look at the actual events, they are more nuanced. Yes, today we are immensely prosperous, healthier, very fortunate because we are benefiting from industrial technologies, but it took a long time, and the first 100 years of the Industrial Revolution, or at least the first 80 years of the Industrial Revolution, from around 1750 to the 1830s, or perhaps as much as 1840s, were very different. And they were very different both because, again, power-related issues and because of the nature of technology. So let's dig a little bit deeper into that causal chain that productivity increases and workers also benefit step. Why would it be the case that there is a general belief that as productivity increases, as we produce more, that's going to encourage firms to want to go and hire more labor? Well, at first you might think that's obvious, right? Every firm, every worker is becoming more productive. So I was previously, using Eric and Veronica as my employees and produced, 1 ton of yarn, and now I'm producing 2 tons of yarn. So output per worker has increased. Perhaps I should hire more. But basic economics tells you no, that's average productivity. What you care about is marginal productivity. How much is Veronica and how much Eric and how much the next worker is contributing to output? Only if marginal productivity increases, we would want to go and hire more labor. There are some reasons why average and marginal productivity may move together, but there are also lots of reasons why they wouldn't. So I think a story that's often told, epitomizes the main tension here. It is a humorous story, or supposed to be humorous, unless you're at the wrong end of it. It says that the factory of the future will have 2 employees, a man and a dog. The man is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to make sure that the man doesn't touch the equipment. So if we're in fact heading to a factory like that, which is not so far from the dreams of some managers and some tech barons, then you can see with better and better equipment, we're going to produce more and more output, more and more yarn. But the humorous part of the story is that we don't need the man, we don't need his dog. So their marginal productivity, their contribution to output is very tiny. Even if my factory becomes 10 times as productive, I'm not going to rush to buy more of these, to hire more of these workers, nor am I going to pay them more necessarily. What this story captures is automation, meaning I am using machines to substitute for tasks previously performed by labor. And if that happens, average productivity increases, but marginal productivity doesn't. And there is no need for firms to rush and try to hire more labor. And that's exactly what happened, but embedded in certain types of power relations in the early stages of the British Industrial Revolution. Those were the textile mills, especially in weaving. After the spinning was automated, then came weaving, and weaving employed a lot of workers, and they were relatively well-paid workers. But within about 20 years, all those weavers experienced about a 50% decline in their wages, and they were substituted by fewer and less skilled workers and machinery. And also the factory system was, just like my reference to who controls information, was a method of control of information. It was a very disciplinarian place when handloom weavers used to have a lot of independence and agency and were able to adjust their working hours, became much more regimented. And in fact, that regimentation, automation often go hand in hand, and it's no surprise that the contraption on the left, which is Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, famous to some of you from Michel Foucault's writing or from the movies of The Guardian of the Galaxy, whichever is your poison, was emblematic of the age, meaning that many employers thought that this is exactly what they should do, be able to monitor people much better. The panopticon itself was never adopted in mass scale in British industry, but actually panopticon came from not from Jeremy Bentham, but his brother, who applied it in Russia before, about 2 decades before Jeremy Bentham itself. And all of this, again, reflecting the importance of power, was embedded in significantly worsening living conditions. During this time, British cities, Manchester, London, Liverpool, became, extremely unhealthy. There were about one toilet for about 300 people outside. Infectious diseases became rampant. Living standards, life expectancy at birth may have fallen as low as 30 during this time period in British cities. All of this may be history. Perhaps I'm just recounting history, and today we are more enlightened, we have different institutions, we have different technologies, so many of those things may be irrelevant. Now, part of the reason why I'm recounting the history is because I'm going to argue that it's not completely irrelevant. And it's not completely irrelevant because I think how the British society overcame this phase, and from around 1840s things became much better, and how it actually fell into this trap have lessons today. And I think one way of seeing that it's not completely irrelevant is to look at the US economy, or at least US economy from the viewpoint of the labor market over the last 50, 60 years. And here I'm doing that by depicting the evolution of real inflation-adjusted weekly earnings for 10 demographic groups distinguished by gender on the left men, on the right women, and by education, going all the way from the top, dark blue is postgraduates, then workers with a college degree but no postgraduate degree, workers with associate degrees or some college, workers with high school degree in green, and workers without a high school in red or orange, whatever that color is. So from 1963, which is when these data start, to the mid-1970s, you see the period of shared prosperity. These curves are on top of each other. They are growing all more or less at the same rate, and they're growing very healthily. This is about a 2.5% per year growth rate. So in 3 decades, you'll double your real income if you were in an economy like this. And people were in an economy like this because I start this data in 1963 because of data availability, but from other sources you can go to the 1950s and the late 1940s, and you see the same pattern, around 2.5% real income. That's very shared, and in fact, in the 50s, inequality is in fact falling. But from around 1980, you see a sea change. Inequality is increasing, but even more jarringly, it's not just that some people are benefiting a lot, some people are benefiting a little, but real wages for low education group, about half of the US population is actually declining. So look at what's the orange or the green curve is doing. It's actually declining quite a significant amount. While the economy is getting rich, workers with limited levels of education and even those with some college or associate degrees are experiencing significant declines in their real wages. So modern times are different. Indeed, the US economy, so did the European economies, achieve some long period, at least 3 decades, perhaps 3.5 decades of shared prosperity. But no, we are seeing some of the same tensions, and I'm going to argue it's also related to power, it's also related to automation. So we're living through some of the same experiences, so we cannot completely be nonchalant and say none of the same issues are going to recur. This is not just a US phenomenon, but US is particularly heightened. Here, looking at an omnibus measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient, you see the US was already a leader in inequality in around the middle of the 1980s and had one of the largest increases in inequality. Some of the other countries have more nuanced increases. For example, here you see Sweden have a large increase in inequality, but wage inequality doesn't increase in inequality. The wage inequality doesn't increase in Sweden. In some other countries, in very few other countries, you see this kind of real wages at the bottom declining, but greater inequality and difficulty of generating robust wage growth for manual workers, for production workers, for office workers is actually very common across the industrialized world. So what happened? So I think the way to understand what happened is to first discuss how it is that the British economy turned a corner and built a very different type of shared prosperity, and how did the American economy build shared prosperity. And they all go back to the same two things that I talked about at the beginning. That productivity bandwagon depends on the fact that productivity increases don't just improve average productivity, but they increase the role of labor, and there is a power distribution and institutional setup so that labor also shares. So this is exactly what happened during the British Industrial Revolution with trade unions, with the direction of technology changing, with the democratization process, and with the government playing much more of a bigger role in cleaning up the cities, in introducing workplace regulations and so on. But let me instead, perhaps Britain is not so interesting for an American audience, let me talk about the United States, and let me talk about the auto industry at the beginning of the 20th century. I think the auto industry is particularly interesting because it really illustrates these forces in a very clear way. So on the top, I'm showing a picture from 1919 from one of Ford's factories. Henry Ford was a leader in automation. He saw ahead of anybody else in the manufacturing sector in the United States that you could do mass production, and to do mass production, you needed better machinery. The machinery needed to take over some of the tasks, and the new electricity improvements would overcome that. He and his engineers understood that you needed a reorganization of the factory to do that, and the Rouge plant is one of the first places where you see that. But Henry Ford was also a leader in something else. He was a leader in introducing new tasks for workers, because he also understood that you cannot just automate work and let machines do the work. Once machines start doing some of the work, then you need more skilled workers to do the technical tasks, to do maintenance, to do inspection, to do the white-collar tasks that are going to be required to make the new engineering facilities much more productive. And you see in the Rouge factory that the new machinery is visible, but also visible are all of these workers that are engaged in new tasks. You know, workers in manufacturing were doing tasks like this, but now they are doing higher level tasks than they were in the prior manufacturing factories. And these new tasks were the critical element for why improvements in productivity went hand in hand with the role of workers actually increasing. But the second important element was that worker voice also increased. You know, the US manufacturing in the beginning of the 20th century, just like British manufacturing in the first half of the 19th century, was dominated by firms, and firms were very harsh in terms of the working conditions they imposed on workers, and they were very tight-fisted when it came to wage gains, and workers couldn't organize for a variety of reasons. In the UK, it was actually banned. There were 2 sets of laws that made it a serious crime for workers to combine and negotiate for their wages together. In the US, too, there was a big struggle, but the auto industry also witnessed big drives, Ford factories, and then the GM factories. This is the United Auto Workers strike in the GM factory, but it was every part of the auto industry, from part suppliers to the big producers, and these improved the working conditions and the wages. So during this period, there was a lot of technological change in the auto industry. The number of automobiles increased by about 100-fold, but employment also skyrocketed in the auto industry, and so the wage growth. So this was how the bandwagon came to be, and these two pillars of the bandwagon is also how it was undone. So why things go wrong in the digital age? Because automation continued, but automation continued without the new task for workers. So this is how a current auto factory looks like. You see the more advanced machinery, the equivalent of what was visible in the Ford factory. Looks nicer in the yellow, but it's the same sort of idea. But there's only one chap, and he's not really engaged in production. I don't know what he's doing, whether he's a cleaner, he's a PhD or not, I don't know. But new tasks don't seem to be that plentiful. So there's much more automation, but much less of the worker complementary or the human complementary things. Now, this is not necessarily the only factor that's affecting wage inequality and wage stagnation in the United States, and it may not be in the top list of 1 or 2 or 3 factors that some people may have suggested. So let me take one more minute to actually argue that it was very important in the US case. So to do that, I'm going to show you another graph from my work with Pascual Restrepo, and a lot of the ideas on automation and empirical work on the importance of automation come from my joint work with Pascual Restrepo, so it also gives me an opportunity to give a shout out to him. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking at more disaggregated demographic groups, not just distinguished by gender and education, but also age and ethnicity. So there are many more of them, and the color coding tells you where their education level. Instead of looking at yearly changes in the real wages, now I'm looking at that critical period from 1980 to today, or from 1980 to 2016, 2017. So this is the cumulative change in the real wages of the relevant demographic group. And you see the line at 0, and you see many of these circles, many of these big circles are below 0, so confirming that there are about half of the demographic groups in the United States that did not benefit much, or in fact may have lost out in the process of economic growth during the last, during that critical period of about 35, 40 years. But the key variable is the one on the horizontal axis. That's our measure of how much automation there has been in the tasks performed by the relevant demographic group. Namely, it is the fraction of tasks that that demographic group used to perform in 1980 that have since been automated. And you see a striking relationship. This red line is the regression line. It explains about 70% of the variation in between group inequality in the data, and it explains a lot of what's going on at the bottom. So almost all of the groups that are suffering in terms of real wage losses are the ones that are experiencing a lot of automation. But automation itself doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in an institutional context, and it happens with a particular vision. For Henry Ford wasn't a believer in worker rights. He was very much against unions, and that's been a common in the United States. But there was a general idea in the United States among managers, and this is actually not US specific, that if your business is doing well, you share some of the gains with the workers. And that was not always out of the sort of the goodness of the heart of the managers. It was also forced by unions, but it was just a general agreement. That was like the Detroit Treaty in the auto industry was all about that. And that changed for 2 reasons. One is, the union movement was declining already, and it got a bigger blow after Reagan fired all of the professional air traffic controllers who went on strike in 1981. But also the sort of the vision or ideology of business leaders changed as well. This is, we are in the building for BFI, Milton Friedman here, very famous economist, brilliant contributions to economics. But in the public domain, Friedman is most famous not for his academic writings, but he's most famous for something he wrote in the New York Times Magazine in 1970, where he said the only social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. So what that meant is that it was the right thing for managers to do, never to give wage rises when you can get away with it. If you can cut wages, it's better, because then you deliver more money to your shareholders. And you should really focus on reducing labor costs as much as you can. That means do more automation. So these two became the bookends around which bargaining became much tougher for workers, fewer wage gains, and technology started moving more and more against workers. Now, these are things we should have worried about in 1980s and 1990s, but if we didn't worry then, we should worry now, because this is the time when a new wave of technologies are coming. And I think part of the reason why we should worry about is because, as that was the case with the previous digital technologies, but perhaps even more, advances in generative AI are highly malleable. It is us, we are going to choose the direction of these technologies. And in particular, a key aspect is going to be whether we're going to use these technologies to do more automation, to do more monitoring, to create the modern versions of the panopticon today, or we're going to use this AI to create new tasks. And there are a number of studies that show that already you can use existing AIs for either one of those purposes. So a number of studies show that you can use AI, generative AI, for automating certain simple white-collar tasks, but you can also use them to make workers better. For example, the paper by Erik Brynjolfsson, Daniel Lee, and Lindsay Raymond shows that generative AI providing better information to customer service associates makes them perform their jobs better. This is just a proof of concept study showing that there are many different things that you can do with this generative AI, so we're going to have to choose to put how much effort we're going to put into advancing it more in the automation direction, or we're going to push it more in the direction of creating new tasks, new information for workers. And in fact, I think the real promise is that we live in an age in which information is abundant. You know, all kinds of information you may want, and many that you do not want is on the internet. But useful information is scarce. Today, if you have an electrical short circuit in your house, you want to know how to fix that. Good luck finding that on the internet. So many people's productivity, including some people who are specialized in, say, becoming an electrician, can be much boosted, and they can perform much more complex tasks if we provide them real-time useful information. And generative AI has that capability. So forget about ChatGPT that can write Shakespearean sonnets, but if you have a version of generative AI that can give you reliable information, that short circuit that you're seeing, it looks like these, and these are the steps you should take, many more people can be much better at the tasks that would be required for jobs like this. So the question is going to become, which direction are we going to develop these technologies in? Well, it's going to matter what vision companies have. It's going to matter what institutional framework it is in, but it's also going to matter what vision the technology leaders have. And I think this is a generally underappreciated aspect, both in general and in the context of the recent AI advances, that you cannot understand the direction of technology, which so far I have put a lot of emphasis on. You cannot understand it just by looking at economic factors. You cannot even understand it just like looking at political factors such as institutions. You also need to think about what are the visions, what are the priorities of the powerful agents who are choosing the science and technology and the research and the development of it. And in the case of digital technologies and AI, that is particularly important because there have been two battling visions, I would say, from the inception of this field. And they have very different implications about what types of technologies you're going to prioritize. The first one that has become completely dominant in Silicon Valley today and in Hollywood movies is associated with this brilliant mathematician, Alan Turing, who was really completely path-breaking in terms of his mathematical genius. I would say he was not as good of a philosopher, but his philosophical writings have been as influential. He articulated the idea of what we want from computers early on in 1950, and he advanced the idea of autonomous machine intelligence, meaning that what we want and what we can have is machine intelligence, meaning capabilities of machines that are high level, like the ones that humans perform, and autonomous, meaning self-acting, that they can actually do this without supervision and close direction by humans. If you can have autonomous machine intelligence, then automation is just one small step ahead. If machines, computers, and other types of machinery are doing things autonomously and very well at an intelligence level, then why do we need the humans? Automate, automate, automate. This was also very much the idea of at the inception of AI. This is the Dartmouth project on AI, where the field of artificial intelligence was christened, and these brilliant people were all disciples of Alan Turing in terms of what they thought AI should do and can do. But more or less around the same time, there was a very different vision. This guy, who was a professor at MIT, Norbert Wiener, a brilliant mathematician and also a wide-ranging thinker, had started writing about the danger of automation and robots even before Turing. And around the 1950s, he articulated a different set of ideas, which in the book with Simon we call machine usefulness, to contrast with machine intelligence. And the idea is that machines should be useful to humans, not intelligent by in and of themselves. And this wasn't just a philosophical writing. There were a number of inspiring engineers and practitioners who actually turned it into practice. One of them was Douglas Engelbart. Many of the things that you depend on today were invented by either Doug Engelbart or his students. The computer mouse, hyperlink, hypertext, menu-driven computers. They all came out of this vision, which Douglas Engelbart built on Wiener, or he actually never refers to Wiener, but perhaps he independently discovered the same sort of ideas. The human-machine complementarity. J.C.R. Licklider, same thing, and his work was both an inspiration to others because he funded a lot of the others, and he also wrote the first protocols that led to the internet, which was very much viewed by J.C.R. Licklider as part of this human-machine symbiosis. Now, the problem is that if we are in the throes of the first vision and we go for automation, I think this has a lot of problems. It has problems for inequality. I'm going to argue it has problems for democracy, both directly and indirectly via inequality. But it may not even deliver the types of productivity gains that we dream of. Why not? Because if indeed it's not pure economic factors, but it's a combination of economic factors and visions that are guiding technology, and visions become dominant, that means that they are pushing you into areas in which the marginal product is lower. So if it was pure economic factors and the market process worked, we will always choose whatever gives us the most productivity or whatever gives most productivity for the firms, for example. But if you get stuck into this vision of saying, well, we're heading towards AGI, that's a desirable thing, even when you're not ready, even when that remains a pipe dream, and there are other opportunities, you're foregoing these other opportunities, and you're rushing into automation. And when you do that, you're in the realm of excessive automation, and you're not even getting the productivity gains. And in fact, it seems quite obvious, at least from my vantage point, that, if you want to revolutionize productivity in the US economy, you cannot do so without increasing the productivity of 250 million people who are workers. So it's it's very obvious that real big productivity gains have to come from making workers more productive, which means this vision has to be part of it. Now, it's even worse than that, because once you are in the realm of the vision that the machines are better and we should do whatever we want to advance the machines, it also changes the nature of politics. Surveillance has many reasons. The Chinese Communist Party is into surveillance for very different reasons than NSA is into surveillance, for very different reasons that private companies are into surveillance. But boundless data collection and using that data to manipulate people is actually complementary or synergistic with the idea that humans can be cast away and human agency is not so important, and we have better algorithm and better ways of organizing society. And I think what you're seeing around is that from very different corners we are coming to accept surveillance as much more of a part of our world. It is surveillance from top down or surveillance in the form of content moderation, but they are all parts of the same process that data is being more and more concentrated in the hands of powerful actors, and then they have to use that data in various different ways, both for monetizing it and in ways that they present it or they use it for getting the conversation going. So if this is really the right diagnosis, in the last 3 minutes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about whether we can have a change in the direction of technology. So to recap, what I have argued is that much more critical than many of the things that are in the public debate, what's really crucial for our future is the direction of technology. Whether that direction is going to emphasize just automation and monitoring of workers, or whether it's going to emphasize creating new tasks and making workers better informed for their jobs and improving their agency. Whether it's going to emphasize and facilitate surveillance, or whether it's going to make people have greater privacy and become better citizens, access to better, more reliable information. These are all questions about direction of technological change. And in the same way that the British Industrial Revolution only started delivering better outcomes and democratic processes became strengthened and worker voice and worker rights became much more tolerable after a round of institutional changes, I think we are in the stage of the AI revolution where we should be thinking about institutional changes. And I think the first step there is to change the narrative. What's wrong with this picture? I think there are two things that are wrong with this picture. One is that it plays into the narrative that the future of technology is in the hands of some tech geniuses and other people should stay away. And it really doesn't emphasize the key aspect that has been the subtext of what I've said, that it is both desirable and technically feasible to have a more pro-human direction for AI, meaning a direction of AI which increases human agency, increases human productivity, increases human information, and does so with inputs from humans. If you elevate the tech sector and leave them out of democratic forces and leave them out of the input from the rest of society, you're not going to achieve that. So how did we achieve that in the past? In the past, we achieved that through a set of countervailing powers. The most important one was government regulation. But government regulation itself was embedded in a democratic process, and it was embedded in civil society action. This gentleman, before he became a villain for being a third-party candidate, was actually one of the most important organizers in the country. He was very much involved in all of the safety regulations from the auto sector to chemicals and to pharmaceuticals, and he sort of was the spear, the head of the spear which the government regulation followed. But also the labor movement. The labor movement played a very important role, and I cannot emphasize enough how important labor voice is if at the end of the day you want technologies to help labor. So it's very difficult to have a coherent innovation strategy where you say, what I want to do is make labor more productive and more essential for the production process, but I don't want any labor voice. That just doesn't seem it's going to be very coherent. So you need somehow labor voice to be there, but again, we have neither this nor this today. Well, Amazon, so that was a small sort of labor movement blip. So these are not easy things to rebuild, but I think if we want better outcomes in the age of AI, we probably need to think about these sorts of things. And I think once you have this sort of civil society action and the labor movement, that is very synergistic to government regulation. I think there's more stirring in the realm of government regulation today, but I think it's much harder to have healthy government regulation unless that regulation is embedded in society, for which you need these sorts of countervailing powers. But I think the most important thing from my point of view is to change the focus from just either it's innovation and more innovation and more innovation. It's the type of innovation that matters, and shift it from other things like the budget deficits or inflation to really this question of, can we redirect our technological change to be more complementary to humans? And this is, again, it wasn't just JCR, Licklider, Engelbart, and Norbert Wiener. The early pioneers of the personal computer era also thought so. Ted Nelson is a legendary figure in this. And his view was that the computer technology would decentralize information, would empower workers, would empower citizens. He thought that computer technology would be the end of large corporations. Ted Nelson and a whole slew of scientists, hackers, thought that the biggest problem was IBM, because IBM was this top-down company and was trying to control information and was trying to control how you could use computers. Of course, little did they know that soon we would have Microsoft, Amazon, Google, much bigger and much more powerful corporations. But they weren't, perhaps they were partly naive, but they weren't completely delusional. The digital computer, digital technology had that decentralization role. We just chose not to use it. And I think in the case of AI, that's even more, so we have to make sure that we use it. So one usual refrain at this point, and I'll end with that, is, well, you may be right. Some of you will think I'm wrong. But even if you're right, the government cannot redirect technological change. Well, I'll just show you as a last figure how it's happened in the energy sector. We are not very close to an energy transition. We are very late, and climate change remains an issue. But the silver lining is that today we actually have the capacity to do that, because over the last 10, 15 years, there has been tremendous amount of innovation directed at renewables. And as a result, renewables that were 10 to 50 times more expensive than fossil fuels in electricity generation today are cost competitive or even more advantageous than fossil fuels. How did that happen? It happened with a little bit of civil society action that started with people wanting to have cleaner products and leading to the regulations that we saw first in California. It led to some carbon pricing in Europe, a little bit in the United States, and it was through the kinds of subsidies that I think are going to be the heart of it if you want to redirect any kind of technological change. There was much more innovation subsidies to clean technologies, and even though this was very imperfect, a lot of it was misspent. Big oil and big energy companies are still thriving. Even that modicum of action from the government was enough to lead to this huge redirection of technological change. I think what was done in the energy sector can be done for digital technologies and AI. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Berkay. I'm a first-year PhD student in the econ department. So let's think of the set of technologies that are labor augmentative. Some speculate, unlike the energy sector, the AI will eventually surpass any human that are associated with all those labor augmenting technologies. And one could be concerned that it will be a dominated strategy for the government to curb those technologies. Do you have any optimism in that sense, or?
Yeah, so I think we're 100% right, and I should have been clearer in that. If you think that AGI is just around the corner and everything that humans do, including science, creativity, flexibility, can be done by machines within a foreseeable amount of time, 20, 30, 40 years, all of this academic. So I don't believe that. I think humans are going to be around, and humans are going to be quite critical, both in some existing tasks that require judgment and flexibility, and also in a lot of new tasks. So that is the basis of my belief. So and moreover, and that's what I was trying to hint at, and we can get I can say one more sentence on that now. But this is what I was referring with excessive automation and productivity gains. If we think that we are just around the corner from AGI and we're going there and we excessively automate, it's a double whammy. You know, you're not getting the productivity gains, but you're also sidelining humans, and you're closing all options for human improvement in the future, from being learning, training, and all sorts of things. So you can actually create a self-fulfilling prophecy of heading towards more and more stuff being delegated to AI, even though it's not AGI in the form that people are dreaming of.
My name's Logan. I'm a second year full-time MBA student. My question is, so like the regulators and the government's all debating about AI right now. Could you elaborate more on your sort of policy prescriptions that kind of follow on from this?
Right. Thank you. That's, of course, an excellent question, but a full answer to that would require me a long time, because in the book that's like chapter 11. So the last chapter is all about those policy. But I'll be very quick, and I'll just talk about four policies. But in the book there are a couple more. None of those are perfect. You need to have multi-pronged approaches. I think the first one is that the US tax code right now leads to excessive automation, or contributes to excessive automation. In the United States, we are essentially taxing capital more or less at zero, at less than 5%. But if you hire labor to perform the same tasks, you you and your employees jointly pay over 35% if taking into account healthcare benefits as well. So that creates a huge wedge, and which means that there's a very strong incentive for firms to use machinery instead of labor. Instead, I think we should level that, and also we should try to create better incentives for training workers. The US is very backward in terms of training workers. Second, that's not going to be enough. I think we need an agency that can identify what are more socially beneficial uses of AI. It's never going to be perfect, but I think it can be done in the same way that we can identify what's clean technology and what's dirty technology. And there's a gray area, for example, carbon capture. And we can have an agency that then provides prizes or subsidies for that. Third, I think there is an ecosystem of innovation in Silicon Valley that's really contributing to this, and it's centered on data collection and monetization of data, and both for its implications on democracy, for mental health, but also as opening up the ecosystem for new innovations and new ideas. We need to change that, and I think there's a very good tool for changing that, which are digital ad taxes. So substantial digital ad taxes so that we encourage or create room for alternative business models based on subscription models, sale of service, voluntary contributions such as Wikipedia, as opposed to monetizing of data. And then finally, I think if you're going to have the kind of tools that I mentioned that will help electricians, that will help white-collar workers, that will help academics, journalists, you need high-quality data. So which means we need to have data markets. So we need to form the infrastructure of data markets. We need to laws for data markets. I think data markets will have to be different because they can't be individual ownership of data given the social dimension of data. So you need to have the architecture for social ownership or collective ownership of data by groups and so on. So, but there are other things that we can think about, and there may be some other ideas that you can come up with.
Hi, my name is Richard. I'm a fourth year into college. I guess one of the things I was really curious about that you talked about was this issue of decentralization in terms of the schemes of like how this technology is being developed. So speaking of decentralization, one thing I was curious about was, do you think there's a role for like, say, the intersection of between blockchain and AI in this case?
Between what, sorry? Blockchain.
Blockchain and AI in terms of that decentralization.
Yeah, I'm not sure about blockchain. I think I am a big believer in decentralization. And I think part of the issue that, you know, this picture here was trying to communicate is that, you know, the Chinese Communist Party's use of the data in the social credit system and Facebook's content moderation may look worlds apart, but there are more parallels than may first meet the eye, and it's all about data control. It's the monopolization of data that's leading. So if you have a more decentralized ownership of data, it may help. I'm not sure whether blockchain is the best way for doing it, because I'm worried that its energy and its structural features would not scale it up and then there may be much more practical ways of doing it, but I think we should explore different sort of ideas there.
Hello, Professor. I'm a third year in the college studying economics. There's this philosopher and economist, Jeremy Rifkin, who talks about the zero marginal cost society, and as we approach this zero marginal cost society, we maybe should seek other forms of structuring firms. He proposes cooperatives as an option. Do you think we need to maybe change the way that firms are structured in the actual current economy if we want to actually improve and as humanity and reach a healthy, I guess, society and economy overall?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think we should definitely be open to different new organizations. I think 25 years ago, nobody would have thought, including Jimmy Wales, that Wikipedia, in the way that it evolved, would actually be a viable entity. Jimmy Wales's first idea was to have an online encyclopedia written by experts. It's only when that failed that it went to a voluntary contribution model, which is essentially a cooperative model. But I don't know that whether it can be replicated. My view is that the market process, so competition for market share as well as competition for status, reputation, and so on and so forth, is an inevitable and irreplaceable part of the innovation process. And we will need innovation, and I think innovation will be very important. On the other hand, what I'm arguing is that market process by itself will not lead to that process. That's why it needs to be a regulated market process, especially when it comes to which types of technologies, which technology paradigms, etc. So for that, more diversity of organizational forms is very important, but I would bet money that for-profit organizations will be a very important part of that still.
Hello, thank you again for coming. I really enjoyed the talk. I thought it was a really interesting topic to be discussing. I wanted to ask about one of the responses or solutions to the dilemma you said is like workers organizing and unions and so forth. But at the same time, this is supposed to be a problem for the fact that, look, this new technology is not only, it's not helping marginal productivity, but average productivity. My question being, doesn't that very structure also make bargaining much harder? Makes it so that yeah, it worked in the 60s, but maybe today, it also looks hard, right? So
100%.
I guess my question is, when you say this is a possible solution, is it, oh, it worked in the past, it could work today? Or are you also looking at recent developments and say look, maybe it should be hard, but I know, with the Amazon movement, are you kind of hopeful with the recent developments, or are those playing against your...
Great question. You're 3 steps ahead and 100% right. But we need to think a little bit more. So in particular, here is, what was your name? So Bruno. So here is Bruno's thought experiment. This is what, for those of you who study economics, this is called the right to manage model of the union, where the union sets the wage and employers choose the quantity and decide everything else, technology, quantity, and so on. So have a better union, they ask for higher wages. What will firms do? Oh, well, labor has become more expensive now, I go even more for automation. So if you have the right to manage model of unions, it will never work and unions will actually backfire. But there's an alternative model, which is that unions are actually negotiating with firms over the organization of production as well. And especially if that is sufficiently cooperative, it will find solutions that firms by themselves would not be able to find. That's where what I was talking about, labor voice. That would say, we can automate work, but this is where we can train the workers, this is where we can introduce new tasks. Is that just being extremely Pollyannish and optimistic? Not really, because even though US management-worker relations have been very dysfunctional, UAW in some points did that. The Longshoremen Union in the West Coast did that, but even more, both German and the Nordic countries' unions are exactly in this business. So for example, in Germany, you have this dual structure where you have unions, but more importantly, you have these work councils and worker representative on corporate boards, and this is exactly what they are talking about. And the corporatist model in the Nordic model is exactly about this as well. So yes, the right to manage model, and I would go further, a very conflictual labor management relationship wouldn't help, so you need to sort of rebuild it. Now, again, if you're going to be realistic, that's going to be very hard in the US, both legal reasons, because there is a law that is interpreted by saying that the negotiation unit is the business unit, so which means that you cannot have sectoral bargains, which are very important for this corporatist model, and because there's a history of this conflictual relationship, but I'm not sure that it's impossible. Next question.
Oh, hello. I had one thing about the surveillance thing. So, I know that the EU, they have stronger privacy laws.
Oh, I had it. Okay.
I know that in the EU that they have stronger privacy laws, and part of their incentive for creating those privacy laws were that they didn't own the tech companies. So the tech companies are based in the US, and they were thinking about their sovereignty and what it would mean if a foreign country's companies had access to their data. What are the incentives then for a place like the US or China to kind of put more guardrails on their surveillance, where they have, because it's the EU is more clear to see when they are not the country with the company.
Right. So if you're cynical, you say US specializes in innovation in tech, Europe specializes in regulating tech. And that's obviously not a good thing. So you have to find the right kind of regulation that still permits innovation, but also puts the right guardrails that channels it in the right direction. So I think it's not 0-1. Europe right now actually has more investment in tech than it did in the past, and it's still trying to find the right type of regulations. Finding the right kind of regulation is not easy. I think data privacy, for example, has backfired in some dimensions, has been successful in some dimensions, so it remains to be seen. But I think the key here, and that's the perspective that I tried to say, but perhaps I didn't say it as clearly as I should have done, which is my sort of hope is that you can have the right type of regulatory framework that would actually encourage innovation, but also changes direction in a more socially beneficial way. So let me give you an example of what that, in the context of surveillance, from Taiwan. So after the protests, there was a government change in Taiwan 5 years ago, and the new government has appointed a new digital minister, Audrey Tang. And Audrey Tang, who was herself a activist and computer scientist and entrepreneur before, has played a role of redirecting technological change in the Taiwan context, both for better privacy protection and creating new pro-democratic platforms. So under her leadership, for example, they created 3 types of platforms. One is for the government data to be used by citizens to monitor what the government and the bureaucrats are doing. Another one for running referendums, and another one, the most innovative one, which is for people to make proposals, and then those proposals to be debated in small groups and then percolate up to becoming legislation, and they actually have led to actual legislation. And how was that done? It wasn't done by the bureaucrats doing so she provided the framework, and then actually the private sector was a very important part of developing these technologies. So I think, again, perhaps that's just much harder in the US. It may be hard in Europe. It certainly is going to be very hard in China. But also, on the other hand, you see a lot of activity in China. And you see a lot of things that are percolating in different ways in all of these ecosystems. So I'm not completely hopeless that it's impossible.